This amount doesn't seem appropriate for someone like you. She didn't shout. She didn't lean in. She didn't even blink. Jessica Keller said it like she'd said it before, like she believed the marble under her feet gave her permission. And maybe it had, because when power comes dressed in policy, prejudice wears a name tag. You could feel the temperature drop, not in degrees but in dignity. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from people too stunned to make noise. A silence you only hear in places built to muffle guilt. Luxury banks, five-star boardrooms, country clubs where the steak is medium rare, but the judgment is well done. Angela Freeman didn't move. She just looked back, and in that pause something shifted, not just in the room but in the system. In exactly 7 minutes, 3 careers would collapse, 1 reputation would be reborn, and an entire institution would be forced to see what it had taught its employees to ignore. Welcome to Unveiled Wealth, where every story unmasks what power tries to hide. Because sometimes when power doesn't speak, it waits. 7 minutes earlier, the revolving doors rotated slow, like they needed a moment to decide who belonged. Angela walked through, alone but not small, and the space greeted her not with warmth, but assessment. Everything in the lobby was designed to impress silently. The vertical slats of European ashwood stretched up toward the vaulted ceiling, filtering sunlight through like some sort of financial cathedral. The walls weren't painted. They were veneered in matte brass. Real brass. Brushed and burnished to catch light like secrets. The floor beneath her sneakers? Not tile. Not marble. Imported limestone. Cut in slabs so wide they had to be crane lifted in during construction. If that floor had a voice, it wouldn't scream. It would sigh. Elegantly, like a rich aunt who wears gloves even when she drinks gin. Angela didn't slow her pace. She didn't pause to admire the 12-foot abstract sculpture near the welcome desk. A twisting helix made from hand-cast aluminum, commissioned from a Brooklyn artist who once sold a piece to MoMA. The sculpture was meant to symbolize innovation and growth. But today it looked more like arrogance frozen in metal. She sat. The waiting area was less bench with brochures and more private lounge you don't belong in a room. Wide armchairs in dark green velvet, the kind of fabric that always feels cool to the touch. Side tables topped with honed travertine, arranged just far enough apart to suggest, privacy isn't for you, it's for the people we actually cater to. On the table in front of her sat a spread of magazines, The Robb Report, Barron's, Wine Spectator. Each aligned with such precision, it felt like touching one might trigger a silent alarm. But Angela wasn't here to read. She was watching, listening, measuring. 2 minutes later, a man in a tailored Navy suit walked through the executive access door. He wasn't rich. He moved rich. The kind of gait that's taught in prep schools and inherited through yachts. A relationship banker, smiling before he even reached him, intercepted with a handshake. Right this way, Mr. Adler. Angela didn't move. Then came the couple, mid-60s, Asian, refined. The kind of quiet wealth that wears handmade loafers and avoids eye contact. They were pointed to the digital kiosk with a half smile. No escort, no greeting. You know what? I've been in rooms like that, not just physically, but socially, where the air doesn't reject you, but it sure doesn't welcome you either. Where the receptionist's smile fades half a second sooner than for the person in front of you. Where luxury doesn't whisper, "You're not allowed," but hums it in the wallpaper. Angela glanced up. The wall clock, Cartier, Panthère de Cartier face, custom mounted in polished bronze, read 9:19 a.m. She'd been sitting for 4 minutes. Not a word from staff, not a glance. 3 other clients had been approached. She had not. She stood, and you better believe every step she took from chair to counter was clocked. Not in seconds, but in assumptions. Beth stood behind the teller window, mid-20s, nervous energy disguised as professionalism. Angela handed over her ID and a withdrawal slip. Beth's smile faltered. $115,000. Her eyes flicked to the paper, then to Angela, then back to the ID, as if hoping one of those would suddenly make more sense, as if the decimal point might rearrange itself into a number someone like this could reasonably request. She didn't say anything right away, just tapped her keyboard with fingers that twitched slightly. Then a glance over her shoulder toward the man at the next window. Mark, senior teller, broad shoulders, narrow views. Angela saw the signal. She'd seen it before, in retail stores, in airports, in hotels that couldn't find her reservation, Beth whispered. Mark turned, walked over, positioned himself behind Beth, not beside her, behind her, looming just enough to change the temperature. Is there a problem here? He asked it to Angela. Not Beth, not because he was confused, but because in this place, the customer is the suspect and the teller's job is to confirm it. Angela didn't blink. No problem at all, she replied steady. Just making a withdrawal. Mark picked up her ID, tilted it toward the light like it might reveal a hidden message, then studied her, then back to the ID, then back again. We've had some unusual activity on these types of accounts lately, he said. These types. That phrase didn't fall. It landed. Let me tell you something. The second someone says these types with that tone, they're not talking about numbers. They're talking about you. And they're counting on you not pushing back, because pushing back makes you the problem. Angela leaned ever so slightly forward, just enough for the cameras to capture her face. What types of accounts would those be? Mark didn't answer. Instead, he called someone else over. And just like that, the lineup was forming. Luxury can polish surfaces, but it can't hide rot forever. Mark didn't look at Beth. He didn't need to. His posture said enough. One hand on the counter, one on his hip. A stance that said, I've done this before, and I've always been right. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately from Angela's ID to her face, then to the purse resting near her wrist. Not a designer label in sight. Then came Richard. You could hear his shoes before you saw him. Those hard-bottom Oxfords that tap too loudly on stone floors, like the man wearing them wants to be noticed. He leaned in, didn't introduce himself, didn't offer help, just lowered his voice like a gossip columnist caught mid-conspiracy. We've had some activity lately, he said, glancing around for no reason at all. Money laundering, check scams. You know how it is. Angela's fingers remained still. Her nails were short, clean, unpainted. A detail they would later claim made her hard to identify. Richard smirked. We just need to verify the funds are actually yours. You understand. It's for your protection. Let me tell you something. When someone says for your protection while standing between you and your money, what they mean is, I don't trust you, but I trust I can get away with it. Angela didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't compliance. It was a countdown. But Richard wasn't finished. Did you come into this money recently? Settlement? Inheritance, maybe? He laughed like he'd just made a clever joke. Mark chuckled. Beth looked down at her keyboard like it had answers she didn't want to see. And then, from across the marble floor, the sound of polished leather heels striking the stone rhythmically. Sharp, certain. The kind of footsteps that made junior staff straighten up and executives silently rehearse what they just said 5 minutes ago. Jessica Keller entered the room. Her navy blazer was tailored within an inch of its breathability. Her heels matched her lipstick. Assertive red. She didn't walk. She declared space. And she never looked at Angela's face. Just the form, the paper, the number. Ma'am, she said with a tight smile that lived nowhere near her eyes. I understand there's some confusion about your withdrawal. Angela's response was calm. There's no confusion. I'm withdrawing my money. Jessica nodded like a school principal preparing for suspension day. $15,000 is a lot of cash to carry. 115, Angela corrected. Jessica blinked, then recovered. Right, 115. May I ask what it's for? There it was, the unspoken. You don't look like someone with that kind of plan. The coded, you must be a risk we haven't labeled yet. The quiet accusation, dressed in linen blend and framed by designer perfume. You know what's funny? They never asked Mr. Adler what his six-figure wire was for. They didn't ask the yoga mom in Lululemon how she intended to handle her joint account. But here they wanted a story. Angela didn't give them one. I'd like to speak with someone who can actually help complete this transaction. I am the branch manager, Jessica replied, voice tightening. There's no one else. And then she leaned in, dropped her voice just enough to sound like she cared, but loud enough that the entire room still heard her. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the check cashing place down the street. They're more familiar with your type of banking needs. That sentence didn't hang in the air. It detonated. A woman near the waiting area gasped. A man in line muttered something under his breath. Beth's hands froze on the keyboard. Her face turned the color of uncertainty. And Richard? He smiled like someone who just won a round he wasn't even supposed to be playing. Funny thing is, discrimination doesn't always arrive with slurs and shouting. Sometimes it shows up in statements with perfect grammar and a quarterly bonus behind them. Angela didn't shout. She didn't cry. She stepped back, pulled out her phone, and in a tone so composed it made everyone more nervous than any outburst ever could, she said, "Hi, it's Angela Freeman. I'm at the downtown branch. They've refused the transaction." Pause. Yes, that's correct. The room shifted. Not physically, psychologically. People started looking. Phones lowered, eyes met, judgments faltered. Jessica's lips parted. She didn't know what she had just walked into, but she was about to find out. She didn't slam the phone down. She didn't need to. Angela placed it on the counter with the same calm precision you'd use to sign a contract worth millions. Her voice still echoed in the ears of everyone who'd pretended not to hear it. They've refused the transaction. Passionate people were watching now. Not just glancing, not just pretending to browse pamphlets. They were watching the way you watch the final seconds before a verdict. Jessica tried to reassert control. She cleared her throat, straightened her posture, and gestured toward the door like she was addressing a misbehaving child. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to conclude your business elsewhere. You're creating a disturbance in our branch." Behind her, Richard crossed his arms and leaned back, like a smug spectator at a show he thought he was starring in. Mark shifted, still playing the quiet muscle. Beth stayed frozen, her fingers curled halfway into a fist, but resting uselessly on the keyboard. The whole branch had paused, not officially, but spiritually. Angela didn't respond. She didn't raise her voice. She just turned her body slightly and stared directly at one of the ceiling-mounted security cameras. The lens blinked its little red light back at her, silently recording every breath in the room. Then she spoke again. One sentence, casually, like she was confirming a lunch reservation. "Diane, I need you at the downtown branch. Now." Jessica heard it, and for the first time something cracked in her expression, a tiny twitch near her right eye. Diane Porter. A name you didn't invoke lightly, a name you didn't say at all, unless you actually had access. But Jessica wasn't ready to panic. Yet. Her confidence was old money wrapped in corporate title. She thought it was enough. Thought maybe Angela was bluffing. Thought maybe this was just another difficult customer trying to escalate to no one. That thought only lasted 117 seconds. Because at 10:24 a.m., the sound of glass doors swinging open fast enough to rattle the decorative orchids made everyone look up. A woman entered the lobby, not in a rush, but in command. Tailored navy suit, heels that clicked like metronomes of authority, and a face that made people move before she even spoke. Diane Porter wasn't the kind of executive who needed to raise her voice. She simply existed at a volume people heard anyway. She scanned the room once. No clipboard, no assistant, just a tablet in one hand and fire in her stride. "Stop this immediately," she said, and the air responded like someone had pulled the oxygen out of the room. Beth stepped back. Mark uncrossed his arms. Richard, somehow paler now, took a full step away from Angela like proximity was radioactive. Jessica blinked, then blinked again. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Why would Diane be here? And then, why was she walking toward the woman in the hoodie? "Do you even know who this is?" Diane said, not looking at Jessica. Her voice was sharp but precise, like a scalpel, not a hammer. She gestured toward Angela. "This is Angela Freeman, the CEO of this institution." Ah, the words didn't echo. They detonated. And here's the thing. When a truth like that hits, it doesn't just humiliate, it recalibrates reality. Jessica took half a step back. Mark's Adam's apple jumped like it was trying to escape. Richard looked like he was calculating how fast his resume could be edited. Beth? She looked like she was about to cry. Not because she was caught, but because she already knew it was wrong and did nothing. You know what always gets me? It's not the fall, it's how long people think the floor will hold before it finally gives way. Jessica had built her floor on performance reviews and polished behavior. She thought it was solid, but that floor had termites, and Diane just kicked it wide open. Deanne stepped toward Jessica now, slow and silent, like the calm before a boardroom massacre. We've seen the footage, she said. All of it. The delays, the smirks, the treatment of this customer, and others. One, she lifted the tablet slightly. On the screen, split footage. A white customer being greeted with a smile. Angela being asked if she had an inheritance. Another customer, black, elderly, being asked to come back with more ID. Jessica's voice came out smaller than anyone had ever heard it. I wasn't aware. Diane cut her off with one raised eyebrow. You didn't need to be aware. You needed to be decent. And just like that, silence fell again. Not the silence of routine banking. This was different. Truth is, there are moments when a room changes temperature without touching the thermostat, when even the luxury, marble, brass, chilled air can't shield people from what they've done. This was one of those moments, and Angela? She hadn't moved once, because when you own the building, you don't flinch. Angela hadn't said a word since the reveal. She didn't have to. That's the thing about true power. It doesn't need to perform. It simply occupies space, and that space starts doing the talking for you. Jessica stood frozen, face blank, but behind her eyes a war had begun, trying to rewind, justify, reconstruct a timeline where maybe, just maybe, this wasn't her career ending in real time, but the reality didn't wait. Diane stepped back from Angela with measured grace, then turned slowly toward the staff like a conductor preparing an orchestra. Except this wasn't music. It was reckoning. Everything that happened here, she said, her voice now low and surgical, has been recorded. Audio, video, behavior, tone. The screens behind the counter flickered as if they too were reacting to the temperature shift. Let me tell you something. When a luxury institution turns against its own illusion of polish, the sound it makes isn't loud. It's soft, controlled. The sound of a velvet curtain being pulled back to reveal something rotten underneath. Diane raised her tablet again, and on its surface played the same footage from earlier. Split screen, Beth greeting a blonde woman in casual clothes with warm laughter, then freezing like a mannequin when Angela stepped up. Another scene, Mark asking for extra verification from a janitor, while Richard nodded in smug agreement. It wasn't just poor service. It was a pattern, a culture. Jessica, Diane said, and that single name hit harder than any insult. She didn't need to say a title. Titles didn't matter anymore. This branch has the highest client attrition rate for customers of color in the entire region. The lowest approval ratings, the most flagged complaints, most of which were suppressed before they made it into official review. She paused. Do you know what that tells me? Jessica swallowed but didn't speak. It tells me you weren't just bad at your job. You were good at maintaining an image that only served a fraction of who we claim to be. The marble beneath their feet suddenly felt less like prestige and more like evidence. The chandelier above, glass-blown, Italian, hanging from a hand-forged bronze mount, didn't sparkle anymore. It just hung, quietly, like judgment. Richard took a step back, mouth opening as if to interject. But Diane turned to him with the calm precision of someone who's dismantled better defenses than whatever he was about to say. And you? Her eyes scanned him like a forensic report, mocking customers, whispering slurs under your breath, instigating harassment with a smirk. Do you think that makes you clever? Because it doesn't. It makes you replaceable. Beth, who had remained nearly catatonic through the entire exchange, finally spoke. Not loud, not dramatic, but just enough. I didn't know what to do. Her voice cracked, not for sympathy, but from the weight of complicity. Diane's tone shifted, just slightly, not softer, sharper. Then learn. Because silence doesn't save you, it just seats you closer to the damage. You know what's wild? In rooms like this, filled with velvet ropes, brushed steel accents, Italian upholstery, and bottled still water that cost more than some people's lunch, the thing that usually feels most expensive is the lie. The lie that appearance equals ethics, that polish equals professionalism, that being calm means being fair. But what Angela just exposed, without raising a single decibel, was that all the calm in the world doesn't matter if it's built on exclusion. Diane turned back toward Angela and lowered her tablet slowly, like a curtain call. "I'll leave the final decision to you," she said. "You built this institution. You deserve to decide how to protect it." Angela's head tilted just slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room like a motion sensor scanning for intent. Her voice, when it came, was colder than the marble, smoother than the leather seats, and sharper than the edge of her unspoken tolerance. "Jessica, Richard, Mark, you are terminated, effective immediately." There was no drama, no raised voices, just consequence. Delivered with the precision of someone who had waited her whole career for people like this to stop mistaking politeness for permission. The words landed like a string quartet dropping into silence. Even the background hum of the cash machines paused, as if the building itself was acknowledging the shift. Jessica's lips moved, but no sound came. Richard looked away. Mark blinked, lost in some internal math that was failing to justify a single thing he'd done. Beth stared at Angela as if she were watching a solar eclipse from 10 feet away. Blinding, beautiful, and absolutely not to be ignored. And the rest of the lobby? The customers, the staff? They didn't move. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in a room isn't the firing. It's the realization that someone finally noticed and decided enough was enough. Beth remained at the counter long after Angela had walked away. Not frozen, not broken, just still. Still in that very specific way you get when your hands haven't moved, but your worldview has. The screen in front of her continued to blink, the system still waiting for a command. But the cursor was no longer the only thing left blinking in the room. She slowly turned toward the tall cabinet where deposit slips and courtesy checks were stacked with surgical precision. On a normal day, she might have adjusted them just to look busy. Today, she didn't touch them. Instead, her fingers hovered, hesitant, not because she feared doing something wrong, but because she was finally beginning to understand what wrong actually looked like, and it didn't always scream. Sometimes it smiled. Sometimes it wore Armani and called you ma'am. Sometimes it let you stay silent and feel safe. But now that silence felt more like a bruise, one she'd been walking around with without ever knowing it. Behind her, the glass walls of the conference pod caught a reflection of herself she hadn't noticed before. Same blazer, same hair, but the eyes were different. She looked undone, but not defeated. More like someone who had walked through a lie and come out blinking into the sun. You know what's wild? In luxury spaces like this, you notice everything. Smudges on chrome, fingerprints on glass, the wrong scent diffuser setting. But no one ever thought to notice the smudge on the culture itself. Until today. A few feet away, a customer who had witnessed the entire scene, an older black gentleman in a postal uniform, paused as he passed Beth's station. He didn't say much. Just nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if handing over something invisible. And in that small gesture, Beth didn't feel forgiven. She felt seen. And that was harder to carry. The air in the branch was beginning to move again. Not much. Just enough for people to pretend the world hadn't tilted. Documents shuffled, calls resumed. But no one sat the same way. Not after that. The lobby's curated serenity, the soft jazz, the freshly steamed orchids near the espresso bar, the exact 70 bodega climate control, felt performative now, like makeup left on after a confession. From her place at the counter, Beth looked toward the glass entrance. Angela had disappeared, but the weight she left behind hadn't. And here's the thing. Some people enter a space, get what they came for, and leave. Angela didn't. She entered, she watched, she exposed. Then she left the room exactly as it was. Except now everyone could finally see it for what it had always been. The boardroom didn't empty so much as it unraveled. Executives didn't exit in formation. They scattered like documents caught in a sudden draft. No one made eye contact. Everyone made phone calls. Behind the double-pane glass wall, the reflections of power suits and loosened ties looked like corporate ghosts. People who had spent decades building distance between themselves and consequences, only to realize that distance had been closing inch by inch, silently, with every ignored report and every overlooked complaint. Outside the room, the usually sterile hallway hummed with energy no one dared speak aloud. The PR director stood near the elevator, eyes darting between her phone and the emergency response folder she had pulled from a drawer labeled theoretical. Nothing in that folder covered what to do when your CEO drops the mic by not saying anything. Legal counsel had already requested the raw footage, twice, while compliance leads debated if culture breach could be quantified in basis points. Let me tell you something. Power rarely dies in front of cameras. It dies in CC lines, in whispered strategy calls, in the silence of people pretending to reposition instead of admit they were never aligned to begin with. And the most dangerous person in a structure like this? It's not the loudest critic. It's the one who's already seen everything, written nothing down, and still remembers the date, the tone, and the pause between words. The one who let you dig your own grave without rushing the funeral. That's Angela, and they knew it now. In the corner office next to the boardroom, someone asked quietly, "Has she requested a follow-up meeting?" The answer came slower than expected. She hasn't requested anything. That made them more nervous, because requests can be managed. But silence. Silence means someone's already moved 3 steps ahead and doesn't need your permission to finish the game. Funny thing is, Angela didn't storm the building. She didn't threaten to shut it down. She didn't sue. She just let the camera roll. And now the bank's internal Slack was lighting up with more activity than the last 6 quarters of product launches combined. Angela hadn't said she was coming back, but the elevators, they were already expecting her. Angela left the room without looking back, not because she didn't care what happened next, but because she already knew. The weight of her last sentence still hung in the air like expensive perfume, lingering, invisible, undeniable. No one moved for at least 10 seconds. In a room full of people who manage billions, no one could manage eye contact. It wasn't until the door hissed shut behind her that movement resumed. The CMO adjusted her collar like she'd suddenly realized it didn't match the moment. The COO reached for his iPad but ended up only unlocking it, staring at the home screen like it might offer a script. No one dared speak first, not out loud. But under the table, phones buzzed. 2 executives sent texts to their private legal contacts. One began writing a resignation letter, only to stop halfway and change the document title to Transition Strategy. Across the room, Diane remained standing. She hadn't moved since Angela exited. She didn't need to. Her presence was now the gravity keeping the room from floating back into denial. "We'll be issuing staff-wide compliance realignment within 48 hours, she said, finally breaking the silence. And for the record, this isn't a request. Someone from the far end, emboldened by the new void of power, cleared his throat. What about branches with legacy directors? They've been around long before. Diane didn't flinch. Then they'll either lead with integrity or they'll leave with security escorts. You know what's fascinating? The higher the floor in a corporate tower, the quieter the fear becomes. It doesn't scream, it calculates. And in this room, you could almost hear the sound of reputations trying to pivot midair. A junior VP, not used to this level of tension, scribbled notes furiously, pretending it mattered. The head of investor relations began mentally composing bullet points for the next shareholder call, ones that sounded responsible but stopped short of confession. And here's the real tell. No one said Angela's name. Not once. They talked around it. Leadership, direction, tone from the top, but no one dared say it. Because saying her name meant admitting who let the rot fester while congratulating themselves for diversity reports. When leadership leaves the room, you see people clearly, who stands up to fix, who looks down to protect their seat, and who walks quietly to their office to start rewriting their legacy before someone else does it for them. As Angela stepped away from the podium, the room didn't erupt into applause. It didn't need to. What it did was shift, ever so slightly. The kind of shift you feel when gravity recalibrates. Not because the Earth moved, but because the center of power did. Journalists didn't rush forward. They double-checked their notes, making sure they got every number, every word, every pause. The microphones on their desks, usually hot with commentary, stayed cold. What do you say when someone just redefined your entire framework for accountability? By noon, the story had reached every outlet, not as a scandal, as a benchmark. The headlines weren't sensational, they were clinical. Meridian announces 50 entrepreneurs equity overhaul. CEO Freeman links bonus pay to racial fairness. But the comment sections told the real story. Some praised her, others questioned her, but no one ignored her. And that's when it got interesting. By 3 p.m., at least 4 competing banks had posted vague statements about reviewing internal equity strategies. One even launched a landing page within hours, full of smiling stock photos and recycled mission statements, clearly built in panic. A reporter leaked an internal email from another firm's CEO. Do we have anything like what Freeman just announced? If not, get me options by Monday. You know what that is? That's not leadership. That's legacy catching fire. Because when someone like Angela moves first, the rest of the industry doesn't follow out of admiration. They follow because silence becomes liability and delay becomes confession. Inside Meridian itself, things had already started shifting beneath the surface. Department heads scheduled emergency recalibration calls. Compliance teams were reassigned. Frontline training decks were being rewritten in real time. Branch managers were being told not to wait for direction, but to start cleaning their house. You could feel it on the intranet. A new tab had appeared. Equity Tracker, live. Every employee now saw the same dashboard Angela had watched alone for years. Metrics weren't hidden anymore. They were projected, measured, compared. Real-time performance by branch, filtered by treatment disparity, and no one could look away. In one regional office, a manager quietly removed his own framed top producer certificate after seeing his branch score lowest in equitable service delivery. In another, a teller who had once been overlooked for promotion was now leading the training session. And across the country, in a bank not affiliated with Meridian, a regional VP walked into his Monday meeting with a printout of Angela Freeman's full speech. Not to criticize it, to mirror it. Here's the truth they don't teach in MBA programs. Real change doesn't spread like wildfire. It spreads like pressure, and Freeman had just shifted the weight of expectation onto every boardroom in the country. 3 days after the press conference, the shift began. Not with an email, not with a town hall, but with something quieter, cleaner, more permanent. At the regional headquarters in Chicago, a branch manager walked into his morning meeting to find every training module had been replaced. Not updated, replaced. The file names were the same, but the content was different. Words like efficiency had been replaced with access. Tone had become impact. And the word equity appeared on slide 1, not buried in the appendix. He didn't ask why. He just adjusted his tie and kept reading. At the San Diego call center, the wall where monthly metrics had always been posted, calls per hour, issue resolution time, upsell ratios, was now joined by a new column, bias incident audits. Every agent knew what that meant, and not one of them had the courage to joke about it. You know what's funny? Change doesn't start with slogans. It starts with logistics. The moment new numbers appear on a spreadsheet and no one tells you who approved them, you know something real is happening. Across the country, teams that had once dismissed culture as a soft metric were now opening emails labeled Urgent Equity Training Reboot. But this time, the training wasn't optional. And it didn't begin with legal disclaimers. It began with real stories, case files, anonymized footage, and timelines that revealed how often professional behavior had actually been the face of polite exclusion. In Atlanta, a senior vice president canceled a team retreat to reallocate budget toward third-party branch audits. In Dallas, 2 district managers voluntarily submitted their last 12 months of staffing decisions for review, even though no one had asked yet. This wasn't a culture shift. This was a system shake. And the loudest thing about it, was how quiet it all was. At Meridian's internal IT hub, a team of engineers had been quietly working on the back end of the new equity monitoring dashboard. It didn't just track customer satisfaction, it mapped interactions against service standards tied to demographic patterns, using machine learning to flag subtle disparities. A Latina customer waiting longer than the average? Flagged. A disabled veteran being asked for triple documentation? Escalated. A teller using sir or ma'am for some and nothing for others? Noted. No alarms, just accountability. Let me tell you something. A system doesn't change when it's caught. It changes when it knows it's being watched by someone who already knows where the rot begins. And the real beauty? Angela never had to send another email. She wasn't CC'd on these changes. She didn't need to be. Because the message had already landed, not just in policy, but in posture. In one branch in Portland, a team lead asked her staff, "What do you want your footage to look like?" No one laughed. That's when you knew. This wasn't performative. This was protective. Because when people realize the cameras aren't just watching them, they start watching themselves. Her name was Elena Rodriguez. No one had heard of her. No press had covered her. But on a quiet Thursday morning, she sat down in front of a camera. No lights, no makeup. Just the backdrop of a modest branch conference room, and said, "I used to come in with my pay stubs already highlighted, just so no one could say I didn't qualify." She smiled, but it wasn't joy. It was memory. Every time they told me the premium account wasn't available for people in my tier, even though I made more than the guy in line behind me, the camera didn't move. Neither did she. Elena wasn't famous, but her words traveled farther than any headline that week. Later that day, a man named James Chen recorded his own statement. No script, just a folded piece of paper he never even looked at. "I own 2 businesses. I built them from scratch. My credit's perfect. And for 2 years, I couldn't get a single loan officer to meet with me without asking for more paperwork than my white competitors ever had to show." He exhaled slow. "I thought it was just the process, but now I know it was the design." Across the country, these stories started appearing, not leaked, not exposed, but invited. Angela had made it clear. If you've been dismissed by the system we built, this time, we're listening. And listen they did, but not with hashtags, with silence. Because when someone who looks like your customer, your cousin, your neighbor sits in front of a lens and says, "I've been quiet for 10 years, I'm not anymore," you don't respond, you absorb. You know what power really is? Not giving people a voice, letting them speak without interruption. That week, over 90 testimonies were recorded. Not one of them asked for sympathy. They asked for recollection. A banker in Detroit who'd been told to not open accounts for clients with complicated last names. A single mother in Phoenix who came to cash a check and left with a criminal suspicion report because she had no state ID, only a tribal card. A Navy veteran who stood in uniform and still got asked if his funds were really his. No music, no cutaways, just faces and facts. Inside Meridian, the walls began to react. Not physically, culturally. Employees who once rolled their eyes at bias training began volunteering to review old case files. A teller in New Orleans found her own voice shaking when she watched the 3rd story in a row and realized, that was my branch. That was my coworker. That was me. At HQ, a screening room was opened. Looping statements played quietly all day. Executives were told, "You don't have to watch, but you will be asked what you saw." And that changed everything. He used to be introduced at every leadership summit as the numbers guy. Jason Myers, District Director, Mid-Atlantic. Oversaw 47 branches. 5-time recipient of the President's Club Award. Spoke at industry panels about scalable customer experience. Sorny. And yet, when he sat down in front of the Internal Ethics Review Board, the first thing he said wasn't a defense. It was, "I knew." He didn't stutter. "I knew which branches had better service metrics for certain zip codes. I saw which customers got followed, flagged, asked for extra ID, and I didn't stop it because the branches were hitting targets." Let me tell you something. When someone tells the truth at that altitude, you feel it like cabin pressure dropping. Jason wasn't alone. 2 days later, Savannah Clark, former regional performance manager for the West Coast, submitted a statement. Not because she was asked, because she couldn't sleep. She wrote, "I had all the data, we all did, but we buried disparity inside averages. The real numbers were visible, just inconvenient, so we focused on what looked good instead of what was good." That sentence made its way into leadership training slides across every division. And here's the part that shook the system. They weren't fired. Angela didn't demand public shame. She asked for something harder. She asked them to stay and fix it, because some ghosts are more useful when they don't disappear. They remember what allowed the damage and make sure it's never rebuilt. At the internal summit held in Denver, 400 branch managers gathered in a circular auditorium. No stage, no spotlight. Everyone sat at the same level. Jason stood and addressed the room. "We used to talk about consistency like it was the gold standard," he said. "But what we were consistent about was inequity. We just delivered it with polish." The room didn't cheer. It didn't need to, because truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to be said. In the weeks that followed, dozens of former top performers submitted formal acknowledgments, not confessions, commitments to retrain, to rebuild, to finally serve the people they once thought they were managing. And maybe the most powerful part? None of it was posted online. Because redemption that matters doesn't seek visibility. It seeks depth. It had been 71 days since the press conference. Not that she was counting, but time when you're building a new standard doesn't pass. It accumulates, layer by layer, action by action, failure by failure, forgiven only when followed by correction. Angela stepped into the Lexington branch at 9:16 a.m. on a Monday. No announcement, no escort. Just a black cashmere coat and a leather satchel folded at the wrist. She didn't head straight to the counter. She didn't scan the lobby for familiar faces. She just walked the floor. Quietly. The space was clean. Not showroom clean, but lived-in clean. The kind where chairs are straight not because someone arranged them, but because someone respected the room enough not to leave them crooked. The scent wasn't synthetic citrus anymore. It smelled like brewed coffee. Not served for clients, but for everyone. On the wall behind the teller stations, the mission statement had changed. Same brand font, same spacing, but new words, every interaction, measured by dignity. You know what gets you when you least expect it? Not a speech, not a statistic, but when the air feels different. Angela stood near the check deposit kiosk, watched as a young black father in a Navy bomber jacket approached the counter with a toddler balanced on one hip and a stack of envelopes in the other. He didn't look around nervously. He didn't over-explain. He didn't pre-apologize for the crayon marks on one envelope. The teller smiled, not professionally, warmly. "How old is she?" The question wasn't protocol, it was connection. He chuckled. 3, going on 17. The teller laughed, offered her a sticker, then processed the deposit in under 2 minutes. No extra ID, no raised eyebrow, no tone shift when the name on the account came up as hyphenated. Angela didn't flinch, but something behind her rib cage settled, like a chair finally placed where it was always meant to be. She glanced at the service desk. A customer in a wheelchair was being guided, not waved toward, not pointed at, but actually accompanied to the consultation room. Another client, mid-conversation with a banker, was being handed a printout, not a pitch. A breakdown, simple language, highlighted terms, respect as default. Angela took a seat, 3rd row, facing the window. She didn't need to test the system anymore. It was being used by people who had once feared it, and now were owning it. And the beauty? No one recognized her, because the point of all this was that they didn't have to. Angela didn't linger. She never did. She watched the moment, not for performance, but for pattern. Saw the service, measured the silence, noticed that the walls no longer echoed fear. Then she stood. Her heels clicked once against the mat tile. Not loud, just certain. As she walked toward the exit, no one turned to follow her. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't have to. The automatic doors opened into soft autumn air. Gold leaves moved gently across the sidewalk. A busker nearby played something classical on an electric violin. The kind of sound that didn't demand attention, but made you breathe a little deeper anyway. Angela paused. Just for a second. No phone in hand. No headline waiting. Just the world as it is. Finally a little closer to the world as it should be. Behind her, the glass doors closed. But the movement inside didn't change. People were still being greeted, listened to, respected. Not because of who might be watching, but because that's just what the system did now. You know what that is? That's culture. Not a policy, not a press release, but the part of a place that stays even when no one is performing. Angela pulled on her gloves, looked down the street, walked forward. No security detail, no camera crew, no title tag swinging from her shoulder. Because the most powerful moment in leadership is when you know you don't have to be in the room for the room to still behave right. And if this stayed with you, if this story wasn't just heard but felt, then maybe it's time we ask, what would happen if someone like Angela walked into your world? The stories like this don't just entertain you, but make you feel seen. You're in the right place. Subscribe, share, or simply stay. Because power speaks loudest when it doesn't have to raise its voice.